Welcome to the Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host, Jerry Ayub, and today we'll be talking to David Andress. He's a professor of modern history at the University of Portsmouth, and his most recent book is called Cultural Dementia: How the West Has Lost Its History and Risks Losing Everything Else. It focuses specifically on France, the UK, and the US. So we spoke about a number of things in this rather long conversations. We got into obviously what is cultural dementia and why use that term instead of amnesia. Why focus on France, the UK, and the US? We obviously delved into the current crises in these countries. Then we took a step back and we looked into George Orwell's reflection on the relationship between imperialism or colonialism, the UK's welfare state, and the white working class. In France, we spoke about France's Trente Glorieuses. We spoke about the prospects of Le Pen and the far right and her Front National actually winning in France in the next elections. Then we jumped back to the UK. We spoke about the so-called Brexit spirit and how people who support Brexit don't seem to actually know what they want with Brexit. Then we jumped again to the US, spoke about Trumpism and what might come next, the impact of Trumpism, and so on and so forth. So we delved into a number of different issues, tackling them from different angles. We spoke about the failures within left-wing parties, the delusion of so-called socialism in one country, the realities and delusions of isolationism within the British Labour Party, for example, but also more broadly weaknesses within left parties. We tackled the specificity of France and republicanism there. We discussed how Mélenchon and Le Pen agree on, for example, Vichy's status as supposedly not being France. And this brought us then to a discussion on chauvinism on the left in France. And that's just actually part of it. We spoke about many more things. So that's it from me. I don't want to spend too much time summarizing an already long conversation, and I thank you for listening. If you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate anything, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. The music is by Torabit. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is David Andress. I teach at the University of Portsmouth here in England. I've been teaching here since 1994. I guess my specialism really is the 18th and the early 19th century, and particularly the French Revolution. But I've taught a lot of very general kind of introductory level modern history for a long time. And I guess that's the kind of thing that's made me think about these overarching kind of questions of the relationship between history and the present day, which are the kind of things I'm dealing with in this book.
So the book is called Cultural Dementia. Can we start with some background into the book? Why did you choose to focus on specifically these three countries, France, the UK, and the US? And why use parallels to dementia rather than, say amnesia?
Well, I think it is a very important and specific kind of issue to think about this. I mean, the idea that history is a kind of social equivalent to individual memory is a very commonplace kind of cliche, that societies remember the past through their history, and it gives them their identity in the present day and allows them to be functional. That if you don't know who you are, you don't know what to do. And that's often used in a kind of sort of unproblematically positive way. That's a constructive contribution from the historical profession, from history teaching, etc., etc. And really, the thought behind the book really came out of kind of living through most of 2016 and into 2017, as first Britain and then the USA and then France very nearly had some really sort of quite shatteringly disruptive political events taking place, political events which are framed by delusions about the past. The Trumpist vision of the American past, the Brexitist vision of the British past, or the way that Marine Le Pen and the Front National frame the French past. Individually, these are a series of delusions and falsehoods. And there has been a lot of discussion about amnesia and nostalgia, for example, as ways of thinking about this. But I don't think either of those terms really captures the dysfunction, and that this is the issue. And dementia is something that we're all very aware of, have become much more aware of over the last 10 to 20 years. This is, in a really quite grim sense, a fate which awaits a significant percentage of everybody. Our brains will slowly stop working before our bodies. And one of the things that does to you as an individual is it unanchors you in time. And this again is a very common understanding of the effect of dementia. You lose that commonplace, self-evident relationship between who you were, when you were, and where you are now. And it's incredibly profoundly disrupting and troubling and disturbing. And as I mentioned at the front of the book, my own father passed away from dementia nearly 6 years ago now. And this again is part of my thinking and understanding around it. But dementia is more like how history is being treated now than nostalgia or amnesia. Amnesia is just forgetting. You don't know stuff. There's just a gap. Nostalgia is actually longing for what you do remember. Wishing for the past. And the deep root of nostalgia is an idea of homesickness, emerging as a concept in the 19th century. But it involves you actually having a kind of real home to be sick for. And the point that we see in Trumpism, in Brexit, etc., is that it's not amnesia or nostalgia. It's a confected, false representation about what the relationship between the past and the present is. And it is a form of dementia because it encourages people in the present day to mistake their current day position because of what they think the past was. And so particularly in the British context, an enormous amount of guff about past greatness and past glory and the virtues of that, which to anyone who's not British, for example, looking at that is nonsensical. As a starting point, those claims are nonsensical, but they've become profoundly embedded in absolutely top level, even governmental discourse about what British people should understand about the past. So that in itself is a kind of demented delusion. And then the other logical consequence of invoking that kind of metaphor is that this is a degenerative process. That in the context of a country like the UK or France, having to live in the world, having to have international relations with other countries that don't share their delusions about the past, having those delusions is actively harmful. It will actively cause the economic and political position of the country to deteriorate. And of course, that is exactly what we've seen with Brexit, that Britain has destroyed 40 years of trust built up between it and its nearest trading partners. It's at risk of destroying peace in Northern Ireland because of essentially false, deluded, demented beliefs about what Britain actually is because of what it was. So I think the framing is really quite profound in that sense. It captures what's happening. It captures the danger of what's happening. So, it was a choice that I had to make, but I think it's a choice worth making to say to people, yes, I mean this absolutely seriously. This is not a flippant comment. This is our collective brain dying inside us as we see this happen around us.
And why these three countries specifically?
Well, this is a question of power politics, partly. I mean, this is partly it's that in fact, in practice, as it were, there is the coincidence of these really major political developments happening at the same time. From early in 2016, it was very clear that Marine Le Pen in France, for example, was going to be a very serious contender for the French presidency. At the same time as it was also clear that the conventional centre and left political spectrum was breaking down, that the Hollande government's essentially collapsed. This mystery man, Emmanuel Macron, is emerging from the centre and creates this kind of strange bubble of La République en Marche and the various other names they've had for that movement over the last 4 or 5 years. But it was essentially contentless. And the really coherent ideological message in that French debate was the one coming from Marine Le Pen, which was isolationist, chauvinist, traditionalist, and essentially racist. Exactly the kind of message that the Front National has been pumping out for decades now. And for decades, they have existed in French culture, in French politics, and they continue to become more significant. And I think that they have continued to become more significant since that election. You know, the recent polling is suggesting that Le Pen would do even better next time than she did last time. You know, so that, I mean, French culture is moving in that direction. British culture, American culture, we've seen what's happened there over the last few years. And to focus on these three countries is also important in the context of the global position generally. One of the points I make is that these were all at different times in the history of the world, superpowers, as it were, of one kind or another. France is the only nation in the modern period to have had a global empire to rival the British. Both the French and the British still have their fingers in the four corners of the world in terms of neo-colonial and post-colonial relationships. America is America. There it is. You know, spends more on weapons than pretty much everyone else in the world put together. They are massively powerful and significant countries with a massively complex and a dominant imperialist history behind them. And they sit there, you know, on, for example, the United Nations Security Council, alongside Russia and China. You know, between them, they are the majority of the permanent members. All of them have a veto over anything that the UN decides to do in that Security Council context. Imagining them all collapsing towards a kind of crypto-fascism of one kind or another is a recipe to see any idea that there is an international order based on law and rights and respect for people falling apart completely, because in so many other parts of the world it's already, you know, more or less a joke. You know, looking at the role of China in the world, the role of Russia in the world, no humane person would want to see these other three countries heading in the same direction. And the danger, which is still perceptible, is that that's exactly what will happen, that the human rights agenda, for want of a better phrase, lives and dies on how far powerful countries are prepared to support it. And as long as at least some powerful countries are prepared to support it, we've got a fighting chance. But the risk that I'm talking about is that all that just gets given up on in favor of a kind of bizarre, resurgent, chauvinistic imperialism.
You start the book with an intervention by George Orwell, who wrote about the legacy of imperialism and colonialism. Specifically, he wrote about that legacy threatening the very fabric of, in the context of the UK, of a welfare state, with implications for anyone who believes, even like to this day, with implication for anyone who believes in progressive politics broadly defined. Why is that? What did Orwell really see in that?
Well, what Orwell sees, and I think that, I mean, this is always one of the interesting things looking at George Orwell, is he always refused to think about things in conventional terms. He always liked to sort of poke around behind the scenes of the pieties of politics, you know, whether it's coming out as a kind of sort of anti-Stalinist socialist in the 30s, or, you know, with the sort of complexities of his views that you get from Animal Farm to 1984 and so on. And one of the things he's writing about in the immediate post-war years is the difficulty of doing the kind of thing that the British Labour Party was trying to do after 1945, which is to build something that they would call socialism, or at least a social democratic, fairer and more egalitarian society within Britain. While at the same time, and as Orwell's very conscious of, being very firmly attached to the idea that the British Empire has to endure as well. And one of the things that Orwell in his writings is very clear about is that this is opening up a really dangerous temptation for for Western European socialists in Britain, in France, and elsewhere, that their home electorates, their working classes, might find themselves attracted to the idea of benefiting more from empire. And he talks about this in terms of then forming alliances with the USA, getting the material benefits of social democracy for white people living in England and France, partly at least by continuing to exploit brown people elsewhere. And that he's concerned that that would be an acceptable trade-off for a lot of those white working class people, that they've been encouraged too much to think about future socialism in terms of its material benefits for them alone, and not enough to think about the obligations of internationalism. And he is very clear that to make socialism really work, you have to put European and African and Asian countries and peoples on an equal ethical and political footing. And of course, as I say, he's writing this in this particular example in 1947, the year of Indian independence. And it's clear that this is, in a sense, exactly what happens over the next 20 or so years, that as the European powers decolonize, they are simultaneously trying to keep their domestic electorates happy. And so that the decolonization process itself is deeply fraught and highly resisted, and resisted by armed force in the case of France particularly. But it also results in relationships which are still exploitative. There's no sense in which you get to 1960 or 1970 or 1980 and African countries are treated with anything like the respect of an equal partner. They are exploited. And one of the reasons they're exploited is so that people in France, Britain, elsewhere can have relatively comfortable, relatively social democratic lives. And that is what they call in France the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, so sort of 45 to 75, when everything seemed to be getting better all the time if you were a white person living in the country. If you look at what France or Britain is doing in the rest of the world, it's a long list of wars. But they don't matter back home as long as the economy is growing vigorously and there are new hospitals and new schools and new universities and so on. So Orwell is, as Orwell often is, a kind of prophet of what will go wrong if people don't think things through. And everything he says is then, in another sense, still true today. That economic, social, political, ethical relationship between the wealthy countries and everyone else is still in play. And as we go forward into a world of further climate change, further climate disasters, it'll be an even more ethically fraught situation, because those white electorates are not interested in extending the hand of friendship to people who have been dispossessed by civil war, by climate change, by whatever. And so these terrible political dilemmas will persist.
Yeah. So we're recording this in early 2021, in March 2021. Brexit has happened, even though it's still in its early phases, and Trump lost, even though the damage was done, and the GOP has been effectively captured by Trumpism, and probably we haven't heard the end of that story yet. And as for France, as you mentioned before, Marine Le Pen and Front National are actually doing fairly well. They're not in a majority yet, but that the French system is a bit specific. So with that in mind, how would you, and you did already answer part of it, but how would you interpret the present moment we're in? Just that, actually, just that.
Well, I think obviously at one level, everyone was blindsided by COVID, and that has stirred up so many other questions and issues about how we come out of that situation over the next year or two, if we come out of it. But I think France is going to be on a knife edge for the next year or two, really over there's a very serious prospect of the possibility of Marine Le Pen getting into the runoff for the presidency.
Yeah.
And then imagining some kind of bizarre left-wing boycott, which is exactly the kind of thing the French left would do, leaving her to actually win. God knows what happens after that. I think they've become less isolationists ever since they watched Brexit turn into chaos. So they might not try to immediately destroy the European Union, but they would certainly try to do all the terrible racist things they've been dreaming of doing to France's non-white population for many years. Brexit is still just looming chaos. There seems to be no limit to the ability of the British government to be in denial about what it's actually signed up to do, about the nature of international agreements, about what will happen if they break the rules. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be much kind of electoral consequence for being seen to do this. I mean, and this is one of the areas where I think the Brexit spirit and the kind of frankly demented understanding of what the UK is has cemented itself very deeply in the public consciousness. There are lots of very, very stupid ideas about the weight that Britain has to throw around are in circulation all the way up to the cabinet table. And I don't know what kind of reality check is going to affect that. The USA is escaped from Trumpism by a whisker. You know, it was much more than a whisker if you look at the crude vote count of the presidential election, but in terms of the way the system actually works, it was a whisker. And whatever it was, 74 million people voted for Trump. And the way the American system works is there's every prospect that if the Republicans can make enough noise, they'll regain control of at least one house of Congress in less than 2 years' time now. And then we start the whole thing again. And the danger with Trump has always been that there are people there prepared to vote for someone like Donald Trump, saying the kind of things that he says. And the risk, and I and other people talked about this, before he won the 2016 election, that the real risk for the long term is that even if he hadn't won, next time someone like him, but just a little bit more intelligent and less self-indulgent, would win and would have a more coherent program of doing the terrible right-wing things that he faffed around and never got around to doing properly. The political space for someone who is genuinely fascistic in the American political culture has opened wide over the last 4 years. And there are some truly dreadful people in Congress now, absolutely unashamed bigots. Always been plenty of bigots, but this is a new generation of bigots. So I think everything remains extremely dangerous, extremely concerning.
In conversations about Brexit and Trumpism and even like Le Pen and all of that, it's not uncommon to hear that a lot of the reason why you have so many angry people is essentially the consequences of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. And you make an important critique, I feel, in the book of how the academic use of the term neoliberalism, which is one thing, and I mean it's many things already, but how it's become a bit hegemonic in activist circles. And personally as well, I don't think have made any kind of actual critiques because I don't fully understand how it's used most of the time. It's become kind of a word that describes a bit everything, a word that's synonymous with capitalism, even though these two they work together, but they are also quite distinctive. Why is that an issue in your view? How would you describe how it's being used in activist circles, and what are the limitations of that, let's say?
Well, I think one of the key problems with a term like neoliberalism is it takes a word which is already incredibly ambiguous, means a huge range of different things. Liberalism is a fascinating word because you can find people way over on the right and way over on the left, both using it as a swear word in politics, but both meaning essentially completely different things by it. That it is the catch-all kind of whipping boy for political discontent is to look at other people and say they are only liberals or dirty liberals or whatever. So you take all of that foundational ambiguity and then you put neo on the front of it, and you actually you decrease the information content of the term. And clearly, in a technical political science sense, neoliberalism means something absolutely specific, and you can trace a very clear individual intellectual genealogy back to Vienna economists and certain specific individuals getting together after the Second World War, and so on and so forth, through into the birth, for example, of British monetarism as a set of ideas in the 1970s. So it can function as a very specific descriptive label for a current which emerges in right-wing politics and has risen to prominence. But it then serves after that as a catch-all term for pretty much everything that isn't social democracy in the world since the 1970s. So in that sense, you might as well just point and say, reality, history. It's the abandonment of social democracy, which we have decided to label as neoliberalism. Yeah. But it also takes you back to all sorts of different 18th, 19th century trends in economics and so on. It's everything and nothing, and it's a polysyllabic term that people do use as if they have said something by saying it, and very often as if the person they're talking to should know what they mean, and that again is the problem. The other problem, of course, is that quite a lot of what people do seem to mean when they say neoliberalism is the opposite of what they mean when they start talking about populism, which is the other great term that people have decided to use to describe Trump, Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, etc., etc. And then that sets off another whole academic debate about what do you mean when you say populism, and you find people even growing way over onto the left, like Chantal Mouffe, using populism to say some positive things about ways to get out of neoliberalism, ways to escape from technocracy, and so on and so forth. But in practice, most of these populist leaders are fascists, and they put forward fascistic agendas. They're just not quite as brutally obvious about it as 1930s fascists, because nobody wants to be compared to Hitler. But if they can avoid being compared to Hitler and have policies that people like Hitler would have recognized, they're quite happy with that. And I think there's just a sort of willful confusion that circulates in academic terms about really cutting to the sort of long-term ideological chase. And so, there are very, very right-wing people, and just like fascists in the 1920s and 30s, their right-wingness involves an idea of social solidarity for the right kind of people. But that's fascism. That is a description of what fascism was and is. And if you call it populism and then say there are other kinds of populisms that are actually nicer than that, all you've done is obfuscated, and given people the opportunity to say, well, I'm not that kind of populist, I'm this kind of populist, and I believe this and that and the other. And, whereas the fact is, if you're a person of color, if you're an immigrant in many of these societies, what you are seeing is the terrifying rise of violent fascism. Much more violent, for example, in the USA than in Britain or France, but there's plenty of low-level violence in both Britain and France to point to. And these are the realities. And when you look for other academic labels to explain them with, you're actually you're de-explaining them. You're taking away the political force of the labels you could use to explain them and replacing them with something that people just argue about, rather than thinking about what's actually happening.
Yeah, it certainly puts into context the too many think pieces that have argued that the way to tackle, as you said, quote unquote right-wing populism is to just have the same but left-wing populism. And I've never fully understood who do they think would be included in that left-wing populism and where the limits are. And is it just a matter of it being slightly nicer than right-wing populism? And why would that be the main thing to promote? And yet, while reading the book, and this is kind of a parenthesis in some ways, but I couldn't help but think of how other Western and even some non-Western nations might fit in the story as well. From the perspective of a migrant, I've lived in the UK for 4 years. I think most people, for example, most Lebanese, when they see Canada, they think of, well, they seem to be more at ease with immigration than Australia does, even though there is a sizable Lebanese population there. Especially in terms of non-white immigration, I should always emphasize. New Zealand, it would seem, has gone through a somewhat different path as well. Italy may be closer to the identity crisis of Europe. I'm not entirely clear on the phenomena there, although we have personal links there. I think there's even a good argument to make that India is going through a wave of authoritarianism heavily influenced by this sort of quote-unquote identity crisis, a deep-seated one even, Hindutva and all of that stuff. Would you say, as far as you know, that this cultural dementia is largely happening specifically in these three countries, or is this a wider phenomenon that's just being manifested in a specific way in different places?
Well, I mean, the important thing to reflect on, particularly thinking about things from the British context, is, what makes the wider situation this kind of context of dementia is the potential for actual collapse, is the potential for these kind of ideas to literally destroy our prosperity, our place in the world, everything we'd like to have. When you look at some of these other countries you've mentioned, I mean, Italy on the European scale is an interesting case, because in some ways that's a sort of prosperous society which has been on life support for a long time. Its economic growth rates are very low. Demographically, it's one of the oldest countries in Europe. It's already gone through its own experiment with ridiculous, buffoonish populism, with Berlusconi, and subsequently with the Five-Star Movement. The sort of anti-politics, which again turns out to have a really nasty racist edge to it as soon as you lift up the carpet. And it's kind of bumbled through. But of course, what Italy doesn't have is that global expanse of kind of cultural influence, and their kind of a vision of themselves is very much under siege from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, obviously. So there are many of the same individual symptoms, but they don't necessarily add up to the same kind of overall diagnosis, because the situation of the patient is different. And if you looked at those white Commonwealth countries, as British would have traditionally thought of them, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all of them have very different and particular heritages on the one hand of really racist approaches to immigration at certain points in time, much less racist approaches at other. The situation in New Zealand is really interesting, that the extent to which there is a cultural reaching from the white mainstream to valorize Maori identity, and yet at the same time the Maori are as people relatively impoverished, and not a lot is actually being done to do anything about that, to help their actual communities rather than to kind of honor their traditions. And of course in Canada and Australia you have very similar kinds of issues, but with less of that cultural recognition for the First Nations in Canada, for Aboriginal peoples. These are still extremely fraught. And it's one of the interesting things to reflect on about Canada, for example, that once you start to look at how First Nations peoples feel about Canada, you discover a completely different and much less pleasant country to the one you thought you knew about.
Yes.
This has existed way below the surface of the image of what it is to be Canadian for a very long time. But it is now being brought to the surface quite rightly by exactly the kind of forces that Trump and Brexit and the rest of them are against. There is a movement to wider global and racial justice, and there is also a sense in which everything that I've been writing about and talking about is very consciously against that. It's not just kind of opening up into a sort of vacuum. It's opening up as hostility to things that would otherwise be changing in a more progressive direction.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just to focus in on the UK for a bit, you wrote when the book came out in 2018 that back then we were nowhere near actually figuring out what Brexit means, and 3 years later it has quote unquote happened. I mean, it has happened legally, and yet somehow it feels like even the reality of it, as you mentioned before, right up to the upper echelons of government, like the reality of it isn't enough for those who supposedly believe in it to actually tell the rest of us what they mean and what they want with Brexit. And I'll preface the question I have as to like why. So how would you understand that? I'll preface this with a reminder to listeners, which you also write in the book, that Brexit happened. The vote happened a week after a neo-Nazi murdered Joe Cox, a Labour MP. The referendum was non-binding, which I think too many people don't know that specific part, which is a very crucial part. And yet both Labour and the Tory parties immediately, and I'm quoting here, decided to behave instantly as if full obedience to the people's desires were possible, end quote. Of course, I don't know. I mean, for me personally, with all my issues with Jeremy Corbyn, not that I have any fewer issues with the Tories, but specifically, like, he occupies a specific spot, I feel, in history right now as being one of the first, if not the first, to really call for Article 50 at the time to be triggered immediately. All that being said, why did that happen in your view? And what does Brexit actually mean to them? And, what does it mean to you, if that matters?
Well, I mean, the Brexit referendum campaign was extraordinary. Going into the final weeks of the campaign, there was no indication from the opinion polls that the Leave campaign could win.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great unanswered questions that will, no doubt come out when it's too late to make any difference is the whole Cambridge Analytica manipulation of Facebook, various different ways in which illegal funding and illegal targeted activities were used to possibly influence people's vote. But it's very clear that the Leave vote shot up by a crucial 3 or 4%, almost literally in the days before the actual vote. And then shot back down again very quickly afterwards when people thought, hang on, what have we done? But it was too late by then. That it was this extraordinary kind of moment of a belief that this would somehow make a difference. And this again is if you like, the kind of the tragedy of it, and again the kind of the dementia of it, that so many of the people who did actually vote for Brexit, at the surface of their mind, really seem to have believed that they were being held prisoner by the EU, that something liberatory had happened to them personally as a result of this, and that this would make some kind of great positive difference in their lives, which of course it hasn't done and won't. Where some of the currents of this come from, I think again, on the left, it's really interesting to think about the extent to which that those currents of left-wing opposition to the EU, on the one hand, have relied on exaggerating the extent to which it's a capitalist club, exaggerating the extent to which it has rules that make you do things in a neoliberal way, because that is an exaggeration. That's why British railways now belong to Dutch and German nationalised railway companies, because the Dutch and Germans still have nationalised railway companies, but we sold ours to them. There's this kind of sort of crazy paradoxes. But along with that idea that the EU is kind of a limitation on building British socialism, there also goes the kind of historically grounded delusion that British socialism could be built in one country and would be a glorious thing, and we'd be able to do it because the rest of the world couldn't stop us. Which is just another delusion of grandeur. No more or less than the kind of right-wing Brexit vision of us storming off into the future. Britain is a rich country, but it is not that important anymore. And politicians on both sides of the aisle seem to have confused those two facts. That we have leverage, whereas what we just have is an enormous built-up kind of accumulation of inherited wealth, which, if we use it badly, will disappear, and we'll be left with nothing. So these kind of factors are all in play. On both sides, there's a belief that somehow Britain is bigger than the EU, that it could push the EU around once it had established its freedom, and we saw that very clearly in the the actual negotiations involving Ireland, there's a very clear sense on the British side that they would be able to bully the Republic of Ireland into getting the EU to do what Britain wanted. And a very clear sense from the Irish that no, that they were remaining a member state of the EU and they would use the weight of the EU to support their position, which is what happened. And then the British government is, lies to itself about the treaty that it's actually signing and lies to the British public about the consequences of that treaty, and is now lying to itself about its ability to tear up that treaty unilaterally and walk away. And here again, we have fairly advanced stage cultural dementia within the British government. They seem to really believe that international law doesn't apply to them, that they can have their own way without consequences about almost anything. And rational political commentators simply do not understand this. It is not a rational position, but it's a position they've talked themselves into, because their vision of Brexit has become one in which Britain can do anything. This is why none of the kind of intermediate forms of Brexit, none of what used to be called soft Brexit, turned out to be politically possible, because all of them involved admitting in some sense that we were still going to be dependent on the EU for something. And so all of them were rejected out of hand, long before Boris Johnson took over, by Theresa May, within the first months of thinking about it. The only position the Tory party would accept was complete disengagement from the European Union and its institutions, and a willful refusal to accept the idea that you might have to follow the EU's rules, which has pushed us to the position where we are now, which is, where you have to fill in a customs form every time you want to post something across the channel, where people are being charged a bloody fortune to get parcels from across the channel, and that's just it now. We're stuck there. We've positioned ourselves behind tariff barriers that we can't avoid, and it's just going to go on from there. One of the other interesting background things, which kind of sort of fits into the larger question of a sort of cultural dementia understanding of the past and the present. It's a point actually made by the writer Otto English, that a lot of the people who really took the lead in pushing for Brexit, the sort of Andrew Lillicoes and Dan Hannons and people like that, they're really kind of activists and the kind of the leadership in the sort of Nigel Farage UKIP side of things. A lot of them have very atypical backgrounds. A lot of them actually have backgrounds which involve them coming from overseas diplomatic postings, British companies based in South America or Africa. They come from a personal background which is kind of more like the British Empire than the EU. Otto calls this kind of sort of ladybird libertarians. They have a sort of 1970s ladybird children's book vision of how Britain should fit into the world and how great everything should be and how lovely Britain should be as a result. And that the actual existence of a modern multicultural society is rather a disappointment to them. So they're engaged in a sort of psychological effort to reconstruct an imagined British childhood of happy white people. I don't know how far you'd want to carry that kind of analysis, but I mean, it makes a good point about how odd some of the views these people have expressed actually are.
That's a good point. So I have two questions that are sort of interlinked. One is like UK specific, and the other one is, I think, more UK, US, and France. I'll see how to ask them. But so we'll start with the first one. Like, in contrast to how Brexit is perceived to many of its backers, and you've elaborated some of that now. Can you maybe expand on just some of these delusions? The example of, I don't even know how to pronounce it, CANZOC or something, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and UK alliance, that comes to mind. For some reason, I think I had missed that as to it being a serious proposal, at least not serious proposal, but like a serious thing that people who support Brexit thought would actually happen. I was, while you were talking, I was looking for that old tweet that I remember being very symbolic by an MP called Heather Wheeler, who's a Tory MP. And it was during the Olympics. And she had posted basically, so now that's, I'm just quoting here, now that's what I call winning. Well done, Team GB and all of our Commonwealth friends. Now for the trade agreements, ... And the map is Empire goes for gold, rest of the world 320, EU post-Brexit 258, and British Empire 396. So she just included all of their, Commonwealth and whatever in one. And I found that very revealing. And it's one of those things that tend to then, be swept under the rug, or it's not really fully analyzed in the evening news or any kind of those things. But I feel like this is really one of those things that she was just one of those who were more blatantly obvious and more honest about what it is she thought of was Brexit. So like, what are some of these other ones, especially like the Kanzuk thing and other stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Kanzuk is a very interesting concept. I mean, it is essentially the idea that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK should form a kind of free movement zone, and that the citizens of the four countries should be able to travel freely between them, and do their business and set up important trading links, and so on and so forth. But what it is, of course, I mean, it's a white people's fantasy of having a certain position in the world, and it probably goes furthest in the mind of someone like Andrew Roberts, who's notable amateur historian, biographer of Churchill, and all these kind of things, who wrote has written more than once in the Daily Telegraph, for example, about the idea that a sort of a Kanzuk alliance, not just a sort of economic but also political and military, should be a force in the world, that it would counterbalance the USA and the EU and Russia and China, and would be one of sort of 4 or 5 great powers in a multipolar world. But it is all just bonkers, and it hinges interestingly on the common perception amongst, I think, a lot of British people, that Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are just like home, because, of course, for over a century, that's exactly how they were marketed to people who are supposed to emigrate there. That there are, pretty much everybody has relatives or former neighbours or whatever in one or other of these countries, and sometimes in most of them. I had an aunt that lived in Canada. I've got friends and relations that live in Australia. Most people do. So there is a kind of an implicit, unthinking understanding that these places are connected together. But of course, in actual practice, when you go beyond the level of kind of individual emigration choices, which of course are also immigration choices, and that doesn't come up very often either, these countries have nothing in common other than what happened in the past. In the present day, they are economically oriented in completely different directions. Their political landscapes are not actually very similar, and that almost nobody in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand is even faintly interested in doing this kind of economic hookup, which would involve them turning their backs on their near neighbours to associate back with the old imperial motherland. It's meaningless to them, but it's very meaningful to exactly the kind of person who is genuinely, nostalgic at one level for the British Empire, and quite demented about the idea that you could literally reconstruct it. And one of the things this never includes, for example, is India. The notion that the British would construct a free movement zone with India is unmentionable. Absolutely impossible, because what frames this essentially is racism. It's about white people having more freedom to do the things that make white people rich, and thus staying richer longer. And right from the beginning of the Brexit process, when the Tories have reached out to India and said, can we have some more trade deals? And the Indians have said, well, can we have some more visas then, please? And the British have said no. And that is the position. And the fact that the Indian government is itself pretty damn close to being fascist is by the by, because this is a geopolitical matter. But no British government is going to agree a free movement deal with India in the foreseeable future, but they can imagine having one with Canada because their imagination is essentially racist. And that's what a lot of this comes down to.
So yeah, thanks for that as well. And the other thing is just zeroing in a bit on the like the left side of things, at least the mainstream left parties. Of course, as you mentioned, like the Parti Socialiste in France has essentially collapsed. I don't know how they will recover from the last elections. The other left party, being Mélenchon's party, has pretty problematic. Him specifically has pretty problematic. He has pretty problematic views on a lot of things. Not even limiting myself to just lots of things. I'll probably do an episode on that at some point. But like he has a love for lots of authoritarians around the world, and it's a big problem. The US, if we're focusing on the Democratic Party, the Green Party is a very, very weird and specific phenomenon. But the Democratic Party, not that I'm a big fan of Joe Biden, but there does seem to be quite a lot of people, at least at the base, the Sunrise Movement, AOC, everyone around them, that are significantly more progressive than anything that I honestly thought would be possible in America. In Britain, of course, we mentioned Corbyn, but I'm wondering if I think that not many listeners would know the sort of the legacy behind Corbyn, or because it's called Corbynism. I struggle sometimes to understand which bit of Corbynism is about Jeremy Corbyn himself, or because there is a legacy there about the UK Labour Party with Tony Benn's isolationism and all that. And there's even a term, Bennonites, like that's already a term that exists. So what are these left parties missing? Why are they so vulnerable to repeating mistakes? And I'm being very mild here and very kind in some ways, time and time again. And feel free to zero in and focus on one of them, if not all three of them.
Well, you can say different things about this. I think, for example, the Labour Party 2019 general election manifesto had 2 or 3 really good ideas on every page, but by the time you'd finished reading it, your imagination was strained at the concept of any actual political party being able to get all this done. It's a wonderful document of progressive ways in which Britain could be changed. But if it's hard to have seen anybody achieving even a majority of it. There was an enormous kind of overreach. And I think partly that was a sense amongst the kind of people that were putting it together that this was a once in a generation opportunity to just possibly maybe win with a manifesto like this, and then anything becomes possible. But of course they crashed to a historic defeat. I think one of the problems in general with left-wing politics across Europe and North America, really for the last half a century or so, has been in terms of the kind of people who are prepared to dedicate their lives to being extremely left-wing end up in a situation where it's hard to imagine a mainstream voter voting for them. That those people, by the nature of their commitment to what they do, alienate themselves from the mental universe of the people they actually need to persuade to vote for them. And this is very clear if you look at successful Labour prime ministers since 1945: Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, and Tony Blair. There's only been the 3 of them. And what they all have in common is a determined sense that they're not a weirdo. It turns out Tony Blair was a weirdo the whole time, but he manages very successfully to project the image in the 1990s that he isn't. And that both Attlee and Wilson are extremely down-to-earth individuals who are focused on practicalities, focused on understanding what ordinary people want and need, and delivering that to them as best they can. And it's interesting, of course, that Wilson takes over the Labour Party in the early 60s, after a period of time in which the Labour Party in opposition has chewed itself up about factionalism and nuclear weapons, for example, which are going to come back again in the 1980s and chew up the Labour Party until they get past it. That the kind of people who spend their lifetimes in movements like this often are not the kind of people that people can imagine voting for. And as long as you're attempting to get power, particularly in a rather sclerotic British system, you have to start with the question of how do we get people to vote for us? And one of the other underlying problems of the kind of ways in which socialist politics is practiced is that people seem to be more interested in how do we control the movement? How do we make sure our sympathizers are on the central committee, and how do we then vote off anyone who doesn't agree with us? How do we control the mechanisms, rather than worrying about what that looks like to anybody else? And we're currently in Britain in a rather desperate and tragic situation where the Labour Party as an organisation is shredding itself over the factional rivalry, within the actual apparatus of the party. Never mind the elected MPs or whatever. The actual apparatus of the party is shredding itself because these ideas that if you control that apparatus, you control everything, are so deeply embedded that they cannot step back. They cannot see that this is self-destructive. They're committed to the idea. It's almost a kind of Leninist idea that if you seize these administrative mechanisms, you can make stuff happen. But
like a vanguard party.
Well, exactly. I mean, but in a sense that then, the other legacy of this, of course, across the decades has been just setting up lots and lots of different parties that nobody votes for, but each one thinks it's ideologically purer than the next. And that actually matters to the kind of people who set them up, and this again, you see this played out across social media in the American context, the extent to which deciding that a party is not pure enough for you matters to a significant number of individuals, and that they will determine their course of action, deciding on, how pure an organization is rather than who is it against, who is the enemy. These are inherent problems of left-wing politics. Everyone will say you have to build a broad coalition, and then everyone will use every opportunity to use every tiny difference to shiv each other in the back. That this is how it goes over and over again. They learn the lesson of this for a while. They put in place someone who's a centrist. They win for a bit, then they lose. Then they spend a long time stabbing each other in the back while their enemies do anything they like. Eventually, they'll learn the lesson again. Temporarily, they'll compromise with centrism, but then they'll change their minds again. This is how it plays out, how it has played out over and over again. There's the solid center around which you could build a progressive majority refuses to form. It refuses to come into existence at the wish of people who are undertaking this kind of political activity.
And I'll be amiss not to mention the specificity of what's happening in France with regards to essentially to Islamophobia specifically, and sometimes having trouble figuring out whether that politicians who has that specific position on quote unquote Islamism or their quote unquote Islamist threat, whether that person is on the left or on the right. And we have seen comments that even recently, a few weeks ago, there was Marine Le Pen and this representative of Macron. And weirdly enough, she came out as the relatively moderate one because the other one was the other person was actually accusing her of being very soft on Islam. I'm paraphrasing him here, but that's pretty much what he said. And she got the opportunity basically to present herself as, well, no, I have nothing against the religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was kind of a gift handed, on a golden plate in some ways. I've never managed to fully wrap my head around the Mélenchon phenomenon. And maybe that's sort of like neither here nor there in some ways, although probably would be very relevant in the next elections, especially as a potential boycott vote, if that actually happens as well. From your perspective, and this is sort of, it wasn't really part of our pre-chat, but I just thought about it while we were talking now. What's happening there? what is specifically on the French left, let's say, because I do know of the legacy of republicanism in France specifically, like the specific phenomenon of laïcité as different from secularism and so on, and the centrality of the state in that formulation. It does seem, however, that it gets to be, it's kind of sort of like a I don't know, like a weapon to be used against specific racialized populations, and the left doesn't seem, here I'm saying the left very broadly defined, doesn't seem to be very good at not taking advantage of these authoritarian structures, if that makes sense in any way.
Yes, again, I think I mean, individuals and groups kind of are positioned in different places on the spectrum here. I mean, I'm not a great expert on contemporary French leftist politics, but you can, I mean, you have on the one hand, there are continuous tendencies towards forming groupuscules, as they used to say in the 1970s, just many different fragmentary groups, all with their own agendas, all convinced that they're correct. The specific quality, obviously, of the French Republican values, as they so often say, is what comes into focus there. And you know, it does seem to me that at a lot of levels it's very difficult to persuade someone who's been convinced by their entire education and their entire kind of political awareness that their French Republican values are superior to everything else, that's not in fact true. It's something that the French state and the French education system spends a lot of time and effort trying to inculcate people with at certain levels. And something in the book that I talk about the extent to which this becomes a kind of racialized, hierarchicalized adulation of a central technocratic state. But it's also something that very many people on the French left are deeply committed to. Deeply committed to the idea that the French Republic is both real and metaphysical at the same time, that France really is the Republic, and whenever France does anything that the Republic wouldn't approve of, France isn't the Republic. And this again, Mélenchon and Le Pen singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to talking about Vichy, for example, that Vichy is not the Republic, therefore in some sense it's not France. And therefore, the idea that people like Jacques Chirac and Emmanuel Macron have put forward that France has a moral responsibility to take responsibility for what happened during the war is something they reject, because their kind of national identity and their Republican identity and their progressive identity, in the case of Mélenchon, have all got mixed together. There is a form of progressive chauvinism there on that left side, where admitting that France is not the best country in the world, that it doesn't have the best left-wing ideas, that it doesn't have the best international human rights record, these things become impossible. And of course, this is deeply and profoundly contested by other people who are only too aware of how terrible France's problems with institutional and personal racism are. But the fact that people like Mélenchon are still going around promulgating these views demonstrates how deeply entrenched they are, and that kind of decades of anti-racist activism have in some senses kind of beaten against this wall of chauvinist self-belief without actually having much effect on it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm still a bit baffled by things happening in France. I also have personal connections there, and I live in Switzerland, in Geneva, so like surrounded by France. So at the end of the day, whatever happens there will deeply affect what's happening here as well. I will say, like, to kind of go back to the UK as well, like on a more personal level, I do appreciate the metaphor of the mansion that you spoke about on the History Hit podcast, and I will link that to listeners in the description. You describe Britain, and I believe the other two as well, as like mansions that exist due to inherited wealth. Like, you know, you can have a mansion, but you're not necessarily rich. It's your grandparents had it or whatever, you inherited it. but the mansions are nonetheless crumbling and they need reparation. You said that the Brexiteer impulse to believe that all these people wishing to study and work and live in the UK are a problem. Well, that's pretty much my story as well. Like I moved there as a student, and in the end I had to leave because it was simply not possible to do anything. Jobs were limited. You're not supposed to work more than a very limited number of hours a week, etc., etc. I've mentioned this in other episodes. It just so happens as well that my partner is Italian with settled status in the UK. So during the Brexit stuff, especially in 2016, 2017, she was, told to accelerate the process of becoming to get the settled status, as many Europeans, EU people did back then. But when we both left, it felt kind of a breakup. There was really this sense that with the UK, there was really this sense that this place is going through an identity crisis that's so loud. It's just so loud and in your face constantly, everywhere in the media, constantly 24/7. It's impossible to take the tube in London, and well, now I don't really know, but back then, a couple of years ago, without seeing someone reading the Sun or the Daily Mail and seeing those kinds of headlines and that sort of thing. Just to sort of focus a bit on the mansion, would you just mind explaining that metaphor, just because I really liked it?
Well, I think, as a metaphor, it's really a question of thinking about the idea of what it means to be a wealthy country, and who is wealthy and what that wealth means, and the extent to which that what we have in Britain, and to a significant extent what people have in France and USA and a lot of other historically prosperous countries. It is like having a really, really nice big house that was built hundreds of years ago of very, very high quality materials, but which have deteriorated over time, and which cost an awful lot to maintain. And so any sense that we have that we can do more, that we can be, as the Brexiteers so often talk about, as being kind of agile and bouncing around and doing lots of stuff in the world. Actually, everything about us is really quite kind of crumbly and decayed and problematic, and everything is expensive. Doing anything is really costly if you want to do it properly and actually benefit the population. We're seeing this now. Just the idea of putting one high-speed train line up the middle of the country is turning out to cost, multiple tens or hundreds of billions of pounds, just one train line, because there's just an accumulation of so much property, so much wealth, so much value that's attributed to all the houses and fields and everything in the way. But that value is it's old value congealed. You can't do anything with it. It doesn't turn around and become agility, reinvestment, or it doesn't rejuvenate the country in any way. And this is the problem that we're dealing with at large, that we're all tenants in this huge crumbling mansion. And some people have decided that if they threw out half the tenants, everyone would have more space, but then we'd have much less money to keep fixing the roof. And fixing the roof is what really matters, because otherwise, the whole building will fall down. And we are heading towards a position where the whole building will fall down. In the case of the UK, still quite serious prospect of there not actually being a UK in a few years' time, of there not being a Great Britain, of Scotland and Northern Ireland having gone their own way, one way or another. That things will just fall apart. Because in fact it's a much more delicate job keeping an old crumbling country together than people are prepared to admit.
And you do mention in the book like polls of people who said that they would even be willing to sacrifice their jobs or their prosperity or their economic wealth if that means leaving the EU or what have you. But it's just one of those things I feel people will say that they want, but they obviously don't really want it, and they're not really willing to pay the price for it, because who would? It's just not a nice thing to want. jumping over to the US a bit, and I do sort of enjoy jumping around, and I hope it's not too annoying. Uh,
Right.
Paul Musgrave, just this author I found recently, had this article in the Foreign Policy uh, on the US, accusing political scientists of turning a blind eye to the America's democratic failures. And he wrote this, I should say, a couple of weeks after the pretty much like the coup attempt that happened in Washington, D.C., arguing that, I'm quoting here, that a state built on black repression and local violence was smugly coded as a mature democracy, end quote. 2 months on, reading this, I read this a few days ago. Yeah, I may be forgiven if I didn't even know that there was a coup attempt in America a couple of months ago. It doesn't have this gravitas that follows one. And I mean, it was a different kind of coup attempt than the one happening in Myanmar. Obviously, there's words tend to be used as well, but that's a different debate, I guess. I'm tempted to believe that a bigger part of why it's so difficult to deal with reality in the U.S. is that, and I do think this extends to France and Britain in this case, is that doing so would require dealing with quote unquote the racial question, and at almost every turn, and we see these anxieties of people who, like when there was the roads stuff in Oxford or whatnot, the backlash against usually very like a small number of people who are making this very simple demand, that even those who disagree with that demand, let's say they say no, like Cecil Rhodes' statue in Oxford should not be taken down, the way they're defending the statue isn't that of a calm participant in that debate, if that makes sense. It tends to verge on like hysteria and yelling and insulting, and it tends to be like, no, don't take that toy away from me. So like, don't take it away from me. I'm thinking, and listeners of the podcast know this very well by now, but I'm thinking especially of James Baldwin, who kept on repeating that the U.S., and he was focusing on the U.S. in that case, would not survive, would and will not survive without dealing with its African and African American legacy, and towards indigenous and et cetera. I do think a big part of your book essentially kind of, for me, echoed that kind of sentiment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely central to everything we see going on in the States. Is the race question, that this is it's not even that it's unaddressed, it's that more or less over white supremacy is so baked in to what so many people believe about themselves, that without tackling that kind of baked in nature itself, you can't even get a traction on what might need to be done to have real structural change. There's a significant percentage of the American white population absolutely committed to the idea that they are the ones who are hard done by the system, that America in some metaphysical sense belongs to them, and everyone else who is not like them is illegitimately interfering with what they have by some historic right of conquest, and what, of course, in many cases, the literal right of conquest is what they do in fact have, and that this goes so deep, and it crosses over, and I think this is kind of another pillar of this. It crosses over with the worship of the Constitution. The US Constitution of 1787 to 9 was never supposed to last this long. Nobody imagined it wouldn't be revised 20 or 30 years after it was first written. Nobody really thought of it as a document that would last forever as an actual operating constitution. And the fact that it does, and the fact that so much of American politics is conducted then through essentially sophistry about what the words of that document mean, and entire kind of doctrines about rights to privacy and so on are conducted by sophistry about what the framers actually said. rather than actual political action, it embeds this really, really profound historical conservatism into the practice of politics. It embeds the map of states. It embeds the kind of the version of federalism which gives more power to states that have relatively low populations. It embeds all kind of aspects of the system which mean that really significant popular majorities for change cannot get any traction because they are blocked by an institutional system which at a whole series of points in the past was designed to be explicitly conservative. That's the function of the Senate, was to be conservative. That the function of limitations on the number of representatives, which was decreed decades and decades ago, was to be conservative, was to reduce the power of the more populous parts of the country in favor of the ones where the population was more spread out and more dominant. And of course, when it was done, only the white people could vote. So you've got, on the one hand, the kind of psychology of racism, which dominates a lot of white people's thinking. On the other hand, you've got a constitutional structure itself, which has racism baked into it. But to be a patriotic American, it's very difficult to say we need to tear up the Constitution and start again. You can draw new maps and post them on the internet. You can approach it at a kind of trivial level, but the actual idea that you might not be able to fix America and fix America's race problem without rewriting the Constitution, that's almost literally unimaginable. And indeed, the more you say it, probably the crazier people would think you are. But looking from outside, that's one of the real problems. And where do you go with that?
Yeah, indeed. And thanks for that as well. I had one question before entering kind of the book section. And I'll preface the question with a bit of a pivot that is not unrelated. I'm asking listeners to be a bit patient. But I come from Lebanon, and in Lebanon there is a concept called pretty much cultural amnesia, and some people would argue state-sanctioned cultural amnesia. And that's a reference specifically to the past 3 decades, what's usually referred to as the post-war, after the Civil War of the 70s and 80s. One thing that has happened as well in those 3 decades, that you have this, you might call it a creative class, intellectual class, whatever, intellectuals, writers, artists, etc., trying to challenge that so-called cultural amnesia. But I think it's fair to say that this hasn't impacted wider society in ways that class, let's say, would have liked. I think that's fair to say at this point, 3 decades on. I will link this sort of reflection because obviously amnesia made me think of your the introduction, and the debate in the introduction of whether to call this amnesia or dementia. In Lebanon, I think amnesia would fit better. There was really no glory days of the past for the dementia bit to be relevant. That being said, the angle that I'm trying to the way in which the past is taught in Lebanon is very indicative in the sense that it's not taught. After 1943, after the actual independence, it's simply not mentioned. There's no history textbooks in schools where this is mentioned. And that's part of many problems in Lebanon. Would you say that in the 3 countries that you focused on in this book, that there is a problem with how history is taught? And assuming the answer is yes, because I know the answer is yes, how would you describe the problem, and how can it be different?
It's a problem that has many different dimensions. I think, obviously, although kind of focusing on the overall phenomenon within a kind of label of dementia, you can also see very clearly elements of, I think, both sort of deliberate and unconscious amnesia taking place in all these countries. And the extent to which in the USA, for example, the fact that the history of industrial relations for decades and decades up to the mid-20th century is an extremely violent history of murderous strike breaking and battles and gunfights. is completely erased from general consciousness. You have to be really interested in this kind of stuff to find any of this out. In the British context, in a sense, kind of parallel with what you're saying about the modern history of Lebanon, I think people have largely erased from their minds, for example, the whole Northern Ireland conflict and where it was in the 1970s and the early 1980s, particularly. Just the kind of really grim, dirty war aspect to that, certainly in the early 70s, particularly, right through into the era of IRA hunger strikers and so forth. People have just blanked from their mind, even if they lived through it to a certain extent, they have blanked from their mind exactly what went on. And people who are too young to have lived through it really know nothing about it. Well, certainly for me, my entire childhood, my entire teenage years, was a constant background noise. It was always going on. Everyone knew about it. And yet it's almost completely vanished because it's deeply unpleasant to contemplate. It's just been pushed aside. So all of these things are happening. Thinking about the teaching of history, I think is profoundly difficult to imagine kind of trying to get everything in. I mean, this is the constant problem to imagine history as something that can be taught in schools at a sufficient level of detail and comprehensiveness to actually give people a really kind of deep historical consciousness. I mean, that's not really doable in any sense. It is, I think, much more a case of it would be better to have a much broader, wider culture of public history. We now see ourselves, in the USA and in Britain, in this extraordinary situation of the government pretty much committing itself to defending to the death the random selection of people who've been given statues, and other people committing to the idea that it's really important to take some of those statues down. And historians regularly ironize about this, about how important it is to have a statue in your PhD thesis, and it's carving the statue for your PhD thesis that really takes the time and effort. Statues don't teach anyone anything, but a wider, more kind of multi-voiced, multimedia public history environment in which people were allowed to disagree about what things meant and provoke thought, that might make a difference. But again, like so much, that's where governmental authority is pushing in the other direction, in closing down those kind of dissident voices that still need to make themselves heard.
Well, in the spirit of public history, what are some of the book recommendations that you have to sort of wrap up our conversation?
Yeah, well, I picked out three things. Two of them, I think, very much complementary, almost sort of two different sides of the debate. The first one is by Priya Satya, which is called Time's Monster: History, Conscience, and Britain's Empire, which came out last year, 2020. That's a really interesting, it kind of brings together a lot of other earlier work that she's done as a historian. And it really tries to dig into the kind of consciousness of individuals sort of taking part in the process of putting the British Empire together in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And at the same time to think about what this means in terms of the idea of history and the idea of history having a direction, and how that's used to then partly justify, partly rationalize the processes of empire building itself. So that's a really interesting thing that gets at all sorts of different levels of kind of individual and collective involvement with the project of empire. The second one's by Priyamvada Gopal, Insurgent Empire, which is a couple of years old now, 2019, which really is the other side of the coin. It's about recognizing through the late 19th and early 20th centuries just how kind of intensely contested that imperial experience was, how many different kind of voices there are from amongst the colonized populations, and within radical groups within the British Isles themselves, who are constantly arguing against empire, and in some cases, arguing more violently against empire in kind of sort of insurrectionary ways. That it's this it is never a settled process. It's never a process where all the white people are on one side and all the brown people are on another. It is always a political and ideological fight within the society, as well as a fight, as it were, between societies. So that's a very important message, and I say really complementary to Satya's work on how the imperialists construct themselves and how the anti-imperialists construct themselves. And the other thing I thought I'd mention is my friend Olivetta Telle's book, African Europeans, which came out again last year, which is really just a really elegantly put together tapestry of the interweaving of the African and European experience through history, through individuals who are Africans, who are present in Europe, who are accepted as part of the European population to greater or lesser degree, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's something I think is always really important to remember, that so much of the discourse about race is sort of implicitly engaged with that kind of collision of invented white and black identities that are invented to justify slavery, invented to justify what's going on in the Americas. But the deeper history of Europe is of its engagement with the Mediterranean at large, is of its part of a much larger multi-continental world, where individuals prior to the 19th century are not necessarily treated as if they're just white or just black. The identities are much more complicated and fluid, and it's a really elegant exploration and tapestry of that over a long period of time.
Well, thanks a lot for those recommendations. I've only read Priyamvada's book so far, but the other two look very good as well. And they reminded me of two books that I wrote down because I find that they're relevant. There's a book called Afropean by Johnny Pitts, Afropean Notes from Black Europe. It came out in 2019, I believe. And it's really a good book as well, sort of like an underground documentary experience kind of thing. And the other book is The Good Immigrant, edited by Nikesh Shukla, and one of the authors, Musa Okwonga, was a recent guest on the podcast and came actually 3 times on the podcast to talk about, this book, among other things. Last year's episode was on The Good Immigrant. So with that in mind, thank you a lot for your time. This has really been really informative, widely informative, I should say. And all the best to you, and thanks again.
Thanks very much. Glad to talk to you.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.